On the last Tuesday in April, 73 goats came through the county sale ring under a yellow tag that said Salvage. Not breeding stock, not a starter herd. Salvage. They stood packed against the back fence of Miller's Livestock Exchange, all ribs and burrs and hollow-eyed patients, with old rain dried into their coats and red clay caked above their hooves. A few were Angora crosses, or had been once, before neglect had turned their curls into ropes. Most were brush goats from a tax-seized place up near the state line. 3 had foot rot, 1 had a torn ear, and 1 narrow-faced nanny with 1 cloudy eye leaned so hard into the gate that the auctioneer said, into the microphone, that she was already halfway to being a hide. That was when the men at the rail started laughing. They laughed when the bidding opened at $40 a head and found no hands. They laughed when it dropped to $25. They laughed harder when a young woman in a faded green chore coat, standing alone beside the coffee machine, lifted her number card and kept it lifted. Her name was Mara Ellison. She was 24 years old. She had mud on the cuffs of her jeans, a braid tucked under the collar of her coat, and an envelope of cash in the inside pocket that represented nearly everything she had not spent on feed, fence wire, and her grandmother's prescriptions. The auctioneer looked at her over the microphone. He knew her name. He knew her family, and for one long second he gave her the chance to put the card down. She did not. The gavel fell at $21 a head. 73 goats. $1,533. And Wade Satterfield, who leased more pasture than anyone in the north end of the county, and had been wrong in public only when nobody could prove it, turned toward the rail and said loud enough for half the building to hear, "That girl just bought herself 73 walking buzzard calls." The men laughed again. Mara signed the receipt. She took the carbon copy. She folded it once and slid it into her pocket. Then she walked out to the loading chute without looking at any of them. What Wade did not know was that Mara had not come to buy good goats. She had come to buy light animals. She had come to buy stubborn animals. She had come to buy the only thing in that ring that could walk a ruined hill without ruining it further. And she had come because, 6 weeks earlier, she had found a book her grandfather had hidden in a cedar trunk, and that book said something about the Ellison Ridge that every man in that auction barn would have laughed at, even harder than the goats. It said the hill was not dry. It said the hill was holding water. Mara had come home in March, after her grandmother fell in the kitchen and lay there for 2 hours before the mail carrier heard her calling from the porch. Her grandmother's name was June Ellison. She was 79, sharp as a fencing staple, and not interested in being thanked for anything. When Mara pulled into the yard with 2 duffel bags and a cracked phone charger, June was sitting in a metal chair by the front steps with her right leg braced straight out in front of her. Mara climbed out of the car. June looked her over and said, "You got thinner." Mara said, "You got meaner." June said, "Then we both survived." And that was their reunion. The Ellison place sat on 57 acres of ridgeland that most people in Barlow County considered a sentimental mistake. The house had a sagging tin roof. The barn had 1 good wall and 3 that negotiated with gravity every time the wind came up. The pastures were not pastures anymore. They were briar, broom sedge, young pine, and blackberry canes thick enough to stop a person by the sleeve. Cattle had failed on that slope twice. Hay had failed there forever. Corn had failed there before Mara was born. The land was steep, where it should have been gentle, thin where it should have been rich, and shaded in all the wrong places. Wade Satterfield had offered to lease it 3 times. He said he could clean it up. He said he could put cows on it if June would stop being proud. June told him that if he wanted more grass, He could start by minding the ground he already had. After that, Wade stopped coming to the porch and started talking about the place at the feed store instead. By the time Mara came home, the valley had already decided what would happen. June would heal badly or not at all. Mara would last through one hard season, maybe two. Then the Ellison place would be sold to someone practical. A person with equipment. A person with sense. A person, Wade liked to say, who understood that a hill full of brush was not an inheritance, it was a bill. For the first month, Mara did not argue with any of that. She cooked. She changed bandages. She drove June to physical therapy in town. She patched the bottom fence with wire so rusty it left orange dust on her palms. In the afternoon, she walked the property because June told her to. "Don't just look at it," June said. "Notice it." So Mara noticed. She noticed that the old spring box behind the smokehouse never ran dry, even after 10 cloudless days. She noticed that the blackberry thicket below the east ridge stayed green longer than the grass around it. She noticed that in one bend of the creek, where the water should have been warm and slow by late April, it came over her boots cold enough to make her ankles ache. She noticed that moss grew in a long, crooked seam halfway up the south bank, as if the hill were sweating through its skin. And every evening she wrote these things in a cheap blue notebook from the gas station. June watched from the kitchen table. She never praised the notebook. She never asked to read it. But sometimes she would say one word. Where or when or cold, Mara would answer. June would nod once and return to shelling peas or sorting buttons or mending a shirt that had not needed saving for 15 years. Then, on a wet Thursday in April, June said, "Your granddaddy kept better notes than that." Mara looked up. June was cutting a biscuit in half, not looking at her. "What kind of notes?" "The kind a man keeps when nobody believes him." The book was in a cedar trunk in the back bedroom, wrapped in a wool blanket and tucked under a stack of seed catalogs from the 1980s. It was not a diary. It was not a ledger exactly. It was a field book. The cover had her grandfather's name on it, Calvin Ellison. Inside were maps of the 57 acres, drawn by hand in pencil and ink. Fence lines, creek bends, old wells, rock shelves, soil seams, places where the grass came early. Places where cattle sank to the pastern after a rain. Places where the ground stayed cold in August. There were small circles beside certain spots, each with a number. And in the back of the book, Calvin Ellison had written notes to match them. Not poetic notes, not hopeful notes, careful ones. Clay shelf at 30 inches, water moving under ledge, seep active February through July. Do not cut timber here, holds damp below. And across the map of the lower ridge, beside the blackberry thicket Mara had just been fighting for 2 weeks, he had written one sentence in block letters. Hill holds more water than it shows. Mara read until after midnight. Then she read the same pages again. The next morning she asked June why Calvin had never drilled. June said, "Money." Then she said, "Pride." Then she said, "Men who hold mortgages don't laugh for free." That was all she said. But Mara kept reading. Calvin had believed that a shallow aquifer ran under the east side of the ridge, trapped above a shelf of clay and broken limestone. He had marked 7 possible seeps. He had opened one of them decades ago to feed the house spring. The other 6 he had left alone. On one page, below a rough drawing of the lower pasture, he had written, "Cattle too heavy. Hooves close the skin. Brush needs teeth, not steel." Mara sat with that line for a long time. Brush needs teeth, not steel. That was how goats entered the idea. Not as adrum. Not as a rescue, as a tool. Goats were light. Goats browsed up instead of tearing down. Goats could take blackberry, sumac, honeysuckle, young pine, and poison ivy and turn a strangled hill back into open ground without dragging a tractor across it. Angora crosses could give fiber if their coats recovered. Nannies could give kids if they were strong enough. And if Calvin's book was right, the land could give them water in places no cowherd could use without destroying. The trouble was money. Good goats cost money. Sound goats cost more. The kind of herd that a young woman could build a farm around was not the kind of herd a young woman with $1,500 could buy. So Mara waited for the kind nobody else wanted. 3 weeks later, the sale barn got a salvage lot from a seized farm up near the state line. 73 goats, $21 a head. Wade Satterfield laughed loud enough for her to carry it home with the receipt. By sunset, Mara had borrowed 2 stock trailers from a church deacon, paid his nephew $40 to drive one, and backed both trailers up to the old lower gate of the Ellison place. When the gate opened, the goats came out in a broken rush, then slowed as if the hillside had startled them. They stepped into briars taller than their shoulders. They lifted their heads. They began to eat. The one-eyed nanny came out last. She took 5 steps, stopped beside a clump of honeysuckle, and pulled a mouthful of leaves with such tired determination that Mara smiled before she could stop herself. June watched from the porch with a quilt over her lap. After a while she said, "Your granddaddy would have called that one mercy." Mara said, "Why?" June said, "Because she looks like she's been denied it." Mara did not intend to name the goat. By the end of the week, the goat was Mercy. The first 2 months were not pretty. 4 goats died, 1 in the first 48 hours. 2 from problems they had carried in with them. 1 from a bad kidding Mara had no skill yet to handle. She buried them along the edge of the hardwoods and marked the places with flat stones. She wrote each death in the blue notebook: date, weather, symptoms, where the animal had been found, what she had tried, what she would do differently if she ever saw the signs again. That last line hurt the most, because sometimes the honest answer was nothing. Caleb Fry, the deacon's nephew, started coming by after school to help for $10 an hour and whatever supper June put on the table. He was 16, quiet, and built like a fence post. He could swing a brush hook all afternoon without complaining, which made him more valuable than half the men who had laughed at the auction. By June, he and Mara had cleared a walking lane through the lower ridge. By July, the goats had opened the blackberry thicket enough for sunlight to reach the ground. By August, grass that had not been seen in years began to come through the old stems, thin at first, then stronger. And Mercy, the one-eyed nanny Wade had called buzzard bait without knowing her name, became the lead animal every evening when Mara moved the herd to fresh browse. She did not move fast. She did not need to. The others followed her anyway. Mara noticed something else that summer. In the heat of the afternoon, the goats kept drifting to the creek bend below the east ridge. Not to the sunny side where the water ran clear over stone, but to a shaded cut under a leaning sycamore where the bank stayed wet, even when it had not rained. One evening, after the goats moved off, Mara stepped down into the creek and put her hand against the bank. The mud was cold. Not cool, cold. She walked back to the house with her boots full of water and opened Calvin's field book to the map. The creek bend was circle number 18. In the back of the book his note said, "Water rising from below. Strongest in drought. Do not open without a reason." Mara read that line 3 times. Then she wrote in her notebook. What counts as a reason? She did not yet know the answer. The first money came from the coats. A shearer named Leon Pruitt drove up from the next county in September, because the extension agent owed June a favor and still remembered Calvin Ellison's pears. Leon was in his 60s, narrow through the shoulders, and had hands so quick they seemed to finish a job before the goat understood it had begun. He sheared the Angora crosses and sorted the fleeces on a tarp beside the barn. When he was done, he stood with his thumbs in his pockets and stared at the pile. Mara braced herself. Leon said, "This isn't trash." Mara waited. He said, "It's rough, it's dirty, but there's staple length in here. Clean it right, you've got hand spinner mohair. Not mill grade. Better than that for the right buyer." June, from the porch, said, "How right?" Leon looked at her. $4 a pound, if she doesn't let the feed store man talk first. He gave Mara the number of a woman outside Boone who bought from small farms. The woman came the following Saturday, crawled her hand through 3 sacks of washed fiber, and paid cash for all of it. $680. Not enough to save a farm, enough to change the shape of a mistake. When Mara laid the cash on the kitchen table, June counted it once. Then she said, "That is not luck yet." Mara said, "What is it?" June folded the bills and pushed them back. "It is evidence." By fall, the valley had begun to notice the goats. People did not admit this directly. They slowed down on the county road. They looked through the windshield. They mentioned, casually, that the Ellison lower ridge looked less ragged than it used to. Wade Satterfield heard every one of those comments and gave each of them the same answer. Brush always looks better before winter. Or, goats are easy until they get sick. Or, first year fools everybody. He said it with confidence, because confidence had worked for him longer than most tools. Mara heard about it from Caleb, who heard it from his father, who heard it at the feed store. She only said, "He may be right about winter." That answer disappointed Caleb. He wanted anger. Mara had work. Winter came hard in the second week of December. Ice first, then sleet, then a wet snow that bent the young pines across the fence. Mara and Caleb spent 2 days hauling pallets and tin sheets to the lee side of the hardwood stand, building a windbreak ugly enough to survive. June sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list of every animal Mara needed to watch. Because June had grown up before veterinarians were something poor people called quickly. Mercy developed a cough. 2 kids came too early and died. 1 buck broke through a panel and cut his shoulder deep enough that Mara had to hold pressure with both hands while Caleb drove to town for supplies. On the worst night, Mara stayed in the shelter with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and Mercy's head in her lap. The temperature dropped to 7 degrees. Every hour, Mara stood and counted. 69. 69. 69. At dawn, the herd was still alive. Not untouched, not triumphant, alive. By March, kids began to come in earnest. 28 lived through the first month, 5 did not. Mara wrote all 33 in the notebook, the same way she had written the dead ones the first summer, because she had learned by then that a farm remembers only what a person is humble enough to record. The live kids changed everything. Not because they were cute. Though even June admitted one spotted dueling looked like trouble on legs. They changed everything because people wanted them. Not the big operators, small farms, homesteaders, a fiber woman from Boone, a brush clearing man who rented goats to clear kudzu near highway cuts, a restaurant owner from Asheville who said he wanted 2 wethers raised on browse, not grain. Mara had not advertised. Leon had talked. The fiber buyer had talked. The county road had talked. By June, Mara sold 19 young goats at prices between $90 and $140 each. She kept the best duelings. She kept Mercy's daughter. She bought a better buck with a calm eye and good feet. And when she added the fiber money, the kid sales, and a small brush clearing contract from the Methodist cemetery, the goats had earned more than 3 times what Mara had paid for them. Wade called it a fluke. But he had stopped calling them buzzard calls. That was the first sign. The second sign came in August, when he drove past the Ellison place and saw the lower ridge after a rain. His own fields were brown at the edges. The Ellison ridge was not. It should have been. That was the part that bothered him. The goats had eaten the brush, yes. He could admit that much. But eating brush did not make grass hold green through 4 weeks of heat. He slowed at the county road. At the bottom of the ridge, where blackberries had been taller than a man the year before, a seam of grass ran bright from the creek bend toward the old barn. Not watered, not irrigated. Bright. Wade drove on. Then he came back the next morning and drove on again. Mara saw him both times from the barn. She said nothing, because by then she had seen it too. The hill was showing its hand. That September, Mara went to the county office and asked for well records. The clerk asked which parcel. Mara gave the number. The clerk raised her eyebrows. Ellison Ridge. Yes, nobody drills up there. My grandfather thought somebody should. The clerk shrugged and brought out a box. Mara spent 4 hours with well logs from every property within 2 miles. 15 wells. 11 had hit usable water between 62 and 91 feet. 3 were shallow and seasonal. 1 was dry. The dry one sat across the fault line Calvin had drawn in his book and marked with a warning. Stops here. Mara drove home with photocopies on the passenger seat and the feeling that she was carrying something alive. That night, she spread the records beside Calvin's field book on the kitchen table. June sat across from her, peeling apples into a dented bowl. After a long while, June said, "You found the county telling him he was right." Mara looked up. "Did you know?" June said, "I knew he was right before the county did. Why didn't you tell me?" June dropped an apple peel into the bowl. "You had to learn the difference between wanting water and needing it." The need came the next summer. Not all at once. That would have been easier. It came through a string of dry weeks when the creek sank lower than Mara had ever seen it, when neighbors started hauling water in plastic tanks, when the grass on Wade's leased pasture turned the color of old rope. The Ellison Ridge held longer. Then even the ridge began to tighten. The goats spent every afternoon along the cold creek bend. They would stand there in the shade, not drinking much, simply staying near the wet bank as if they understood the ground was breathing under them. Mercy was old by then. Her cloudy eye had gone nearly white. She moved with the stiff dignity of an animal that had survived enough to stop explaining herself. One afternoon, Mara watched Mercy leave the herd and walk up from the creek, not down. She stopped in the middle of the lower ridge, at a place where the new grass still held green in a rough oval no wider than a truck bed. Then she pawed the ground once. Mara stood there a long time after Mercy moved on. That evening she opened Calvin's field book. The green oval was circle number 23. The note beside it said, "Perched water over clay. Small spring if opened. Wait until stock make use plain." Stock make use plain. Mara closed the book. Then she called a well driller named Otis Vale, whose number Leon had written on the back of a feed receipt months earlier. Otis came the following Tuesday with a rig that looked older than Mara and louder than weather. He walked the ridge with Calvin's book in one hand and the county logs in the other. At first, he did not say much. At the creek bend, he crouched and touched the bank. At the green oval, he stood with his boots slightly apart and looked back toward the hardwoods. Then he handed the book back to Mara. "Your granddaddy paid attention." Mara said, "Can you drill it?" Otis said, "I can drill a test hole for $1,800. June, who had insisted on walking down with her cane, said, "That was not the question." Otis looked at her. Then he smiled. "Yes, Mom. I believe I can drill it." They started on a Monday morning in July. By noon, Mara had regretted the check 4 times. By 3 o'clock, the bit hit broken limestone at 68 feet. At 72, muddy water jumped up the casing so hard that Otis swore, shut the rig down, and stepped back. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was water spitting against steel. Otis took off his cap. "Well," he said, "that was all. The flow test ran the next day. 12 gallons a minute steady, clean after the flush, cold enough to fog the metal pipe in the afternoon heat. Enough for the goats. Enough for the house. Enough to fill a trough at the barn and keep the lower ridge alive without asking the old spring to do everything." Otis capped it properly and ran a line to the barn. When he finished, he leaned against the truck and looked up the ridge. "I drill where people tell me," he said. "Most of them show me where they wish water was." He nodded toward the capped well. "Your grandfather showed you where it was." News of the well traveled faster than the goats ever had. It traveled through Otis, who was not a gossip but would not lie when asked a direct question. It traveled through the county office, because clerks understand which stories will come back whether they speak or not. It traveled through the feed store because Wade Satterfield was standing there when Otis said the Ellison Ridge had put up 12 gallons a minute at 72 feet in the middle of July. The feed store went quiet. Not completely. A place like that never goes completely quiet, but quiet enough. Wade stared at a stack of mineral blocks as if one of them had called his name. Then he said, 72. Otis said, 72. Wade said. Clean, Otis said, as any I've seen this year. Wade bought nothing that day. He walked out, got in his truck, and sat in the parking lot for 6 minutes before he started the engine. He came to the Ellison place the next Saturday. Mara saw his truck from the barn and felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly, and not anger. Something older. The feeling of every laugh from the auction barn trying to find a place to stand. Wade got out slowly. He was in his 60s, broad through the shoulders, with a face weather had worked on without improving. He stood beside his truck with his hat in both hands. Mara walked out of the barn. June stayed on the porch. Mercy stood at the fence, chewing, one eye clouded white, the other fixed on Wade as if she had kept better records than anyone. Wade said, "Morning." Mara said, "Morning." He looked toward the lower ridge. Came to see the well. Mara waited just long enough for the words to feel like a request. Then she said, "All right." They walked down together. The well cap stood in the green oval, steel against grass, plain as a fence post and twice as hard to argue with. Wade looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the trough by the barn, where water ran clear from the new line, and the goats drank in patient turns. He said, "I told people you threw your money away." Mara said, "I know, I called those goats buzzard calls. I know that too." Wade nodded. The hill made small sounds around them. Hooves in grass, water in the trough, a cicada buzzing in the timber. Wade said, "Your granddaddy and I had words once about this place." Mara had heard that story in pieces. Calvin had refused to sell. Wade had called the ridge useless. Calvin had said useless was what men called a thing before they understood it. Mara said, "He seems to have had words with a lot of people." For the first time, Wade almost smiled. Then he looked back at the well cap. He was right. It was not a speech. It was not enough to undo the laughing, but it was more than Mara had expected. Wade turned his hat in his hands. "If you ever need a trailer," he said, "or a man to stand at the sale ring and keep his mouth shut, you call me." Mara looked at him. Then she said, "Keeping quiet might cost you." Wade nodded once. About time it did. He left after that. No ceremony, no handshake for anyone watching. But a week later, a roll of woven wire appeared beside Mara's lower gate with a receipt tucked under the strap and Wade Satterfield's name crossed out in black marker. June saw it from the porch and said, "Apologies are better when they're useful." Mara said, "Is that what that is?" June said, "From a man like Wade, that is poetry." By the end of the third year, the Ellison place no longer looked saved. That was too clean a word. It looked worked. The lower ridge had grass. The creek bend had a protected spring box. The barn had 2 new walls, and 1 old one that had finally been convinced to stand straight. The goats moved through the pastures in rotation, opening brush and resting ground, the way Calvin's book had said the hill needed. Mara still lost animals. She still made mistakes. She still wrote them down. But the numbers had changed. That year, she sold fiber twice, kids to 8 small farms, and a limited run of browse-fed meat goats to 3 restaurants that used her farm name on menus she had never seen in person. The farm did not make her rich. It made something better than rich. It made a living that came back. And once, in October, Mara found June sitting at the kitchen table with Calvin's field book open in front of her. June had one hand on the page with the lower ridge map. Mara said, "You all right?" June did not look up. He wanted somebody to see it. Mara sat across from her. June said, "Not the water, he saw that." She tapped the page. He wanted somebody to see the place without being ashamed of what it wasn't. Outside, the goats crossed the lower ridge in a loose white line. Not pretty, not fast, just moving through the land as if they had always belonged to it. Mercy was near the back. Old now, slower, still followed. Mara watched through the kitchen window until the herd reached the green seam above the well, where the grass held longer than it should, and the ground stayed cool under summer heat. For years, men had looked at that hill and seen poor soil, too much slope, too much brush, too little use. Calvin Ellison had looked at the same hill and seen clay, limestone, seep lines, shallow water, and the kind of animal light enough to ask for none of it too harshly. Mara had not saved the ridge by believing harder than everyone else. She had saved it by finally listening to what it had been saying. The goats did not find magic under the hill. They found what had always been there, and after that so did everybody else.